Good morning, everybody. Glad to have just barely made it despite some Amtrak issues. Thanks for joining us to talk about the most urgent topic in California today, which is housing. I don't know if any of our panelists had some introductory statements they wanted to do, or if we should just jump into it. Jump into it? Feels like jump into it? Okay, great. Well, let's start on the preeminent housing matter of the day. I think I'm going to do a show of hands here. Who here, Senate Bill 50, who here was surprised that it got a floor vote this year? That it got a floor vote, that it made it to the floor after being, for those of you, which I'm guessing is none of you, but for those of you who don't follow, extremely high-profile housing bill that would force cities to zone for more multi-unit housing near transit, looked dead, was sort of jailbroken out of a committee and got to the Senate floor. So who was surprised that happened? No one. Everyone saw that coming. Can I ask someone to elaborate on why they were pretty confident it was going to get a floor vote despite seemingly being bottled up?
I'm getting looked at the most here. First, thanks for having me. My name is Louis Mirante. I'm the legislative director with California CAYIMBY. We were one of the co-sponsors of Senate Bill 50, a bill by Senator Scott Wiener from San Francisco that required local governments to allow small apartments in high opportunity and transit-rich neighborhoods. We were joined in co-sponsoring that bill by the California Association of Realtors and the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California. So I think the question was, why was I unsurprised that SB 50 got a floor vote this year? It is definitely rare that a housing bill gets as much attention as SB 50 got. But one of the reasons that SB 50 got as much attention as it did was because it responded in proportion to a huge crisis that Californians have at the top of their mind right now. For the first time, PBIC is reporting that voters are putting either housing or homelessness as their top, I think it's top, those are two of the top three issues on voters' minds. And so when something like SB 50 comes forward that proposes to, in our analysis, really respond to the 3.5 million unit shortage that's out there, it generates a lot of discussion. I'm unsurprised that it went to a floor vote because it's unfair to end a discussion like that with procedural moves like holding the bill in Senate appropriations. So I thought the discussion out there in the public would buoy the sails of SB 50 forward to the floor. It didn't buoy him far enough off the floor, but I'm confident in the pro tem statements that she's going to bring back some version of this along with her colleagues, that her House is going to pass something similar or in proportion to the scale of the housing crisis onto the Assembly. So I'm looking forward to that this year.
How much do you chalk that up to pressure on the Senate President, Toni Atkins, specifically sort of reviving that bill?
Well, I think there's pressure. Pressure is real, but I would be remiss if I also didn't point to the pro tem's personal leadership on the issue of housing over the last decade. She obviously was a big champion, has been a big champion for a permanent funding source for affordable housing, has been a housing champion since she was on San Diego City Council. I think she understands that Senator Wiener's bill is the right bill idea and something like it needs to pass, and I think she just thinks this is a good idea, and I agree with her.
Another show of hands. Who was surprised that it did not pass the Senate floor? Senator Wiener had been saying for months he had the votes. Obviously he didn't. Was anyone surprised by that, or was that the outcome you... How about a show of hands for surprise? Everyone, even the YIMBYs thought it was going to fail?
I was surprised.
So Ruby Bolaria-Shifrin from Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, I manage our housing affordability program. And so I don't want to speak to the nitty gritty of the politics of this since we're not as close to the ground. But I think everyone saw that this was not an easy path, regardless of it getting to the floor and getting a vote. So it's hard to say you're surprised if it, I think in our position where we're a little bit more removed, we were supportive of SB 50, but we also, I think we would have been surprised either way.
Assemblyman, unavoidable fault line in this debate was the sort of Los Angeles versus Bay Area one. We see the Bay Area lawmakers like Scott Wiener sort of the driving force behind this, arguably Gavin Newsom, a Bay Area guy, whereas we saw many Democratic senators from LA oppose it. What do you attribute that to? Why do you think housing politics are different in LA than in San Francisco?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important questions to come out of this. Good morning, everybody. Jesse, Gabriel, represent the West San Fernando Valley, suburban Los Angeles County in the Assembly. So a couple of things I think to take into consideration here. One, sort of to what Louis said, this was a bill that got attention in a way that many other pieces of legislation, certainly in my year and a half in the Assembly, have not, right? I mean, it's very infrequent that I have a member of my community come up to me and be actually able to talk about legislation in Sacramento by bill number. And I was constantly asked about SB 50. It really got on the radar for a lot of folks in Southern California. One of the reasons I was not surprised that and I thought the vote would be close, one of the reasons I was not surprised that it didn't pass the Senate was because there was opposition from multiple corners, right? You had very strong opposition from groups who were focused on protecting tenants, fighting against displacement, representing underserved communities, and you felt that in a really strong way, and so much so that on the eve of the vote, you had the Los Angeles County Democratic Party send out an urgent email alert asking people to call their senators to vote no on SB 50. I don't know that I can recall another time when the county party has sent out an email alert on the eve of a vote up here in Sacramento. So that I think was part of it. On the other hand, you had folks from, and this is, in my district I represent sort of all of this, from neighborhood associations, from suburban communities, from preservation groups coming up and saying this is going to destroy single-family neighborhoods, this is going to destroy single-family zoning, this is going to destroy the character of our community and the quality of life that we expect. And so you had opposition, really strong, fervent opposition to the bill from two very different places. And so one of the things that I think we need, that you've alluded to, Jeremy, is more of an LA voice in this conversation. Liam Dillon had a really, I thought, insightful article in the LA Times about how SB 50 sort of ran into, I think he described it as the brick wall that is Los Angeles County. And all but one senator from Los Angeles County either voted against or abstained on that bill. And I think that goes to the fact that we have different politics in LA County, we have different realities that we're facing, and as much as I really admire Senator Wiener and Assemblymember Chu, the respective chairs of our Housing Committee, who have done a lot of great work and are drawing attention to issues that need to be talked about, I think it is important that you have a voice from Los Angeles County, or many voices from Los Angeles County, part of that conversation, because the simple math is LA County is a fourth of the state. It's got a lot of members representing it, and if you don't have support from LA County, you're not going to have a big bill pass the legislature.
I want to bring in the business community here. Matt, this is a policy that a lot of industry groups, obviously real estate, but also folks representing tech firms, for example, large employers in the Bay Area worried about people having a place to live supported. That business support was not enough to overcome the sort of local opposition the Assemblyman was talking about. And so I'm curious to know your thought on the dynamics there. If you're surprised that sort of the business community urging legislators to do this to ease the housing crunch was not more effective, and how that sort of stacks up against local concerns.
Well, if there's anyone more or less popular today than housing developers, it's big business. So I don't know that our opinion carried that much weight. But I want to correct maybe a couple of misconceptions about SB 50, or certainly that I believe to be misconceptions. I don't think this was a north-south divide. I think this was an urban, rural, suburban divide. In the Bay Area, our largely suburban senators voted against it. This was about wealthy suburbs not wanting to change. And we saw it across the state. Even Republican senators from the Central Valley voted in favor of it because there was one floor speech where a senator was saying, I'm sick and tired of my rice fields being plowed under for single-family subdivisions to house the Bay Area's workforce. So the fault lines were not so much north-south as they were rural, urban, and suburban. I would also like to, I'm going to put on my angry curmudgeon hat here. There are three basic impediments to building housing. There's simply not enough land zoned at the right densities. That's what SB 50 sought to address. That's the first bucket. The second bucket, which is harder to address, that's the process. That's CEQA, that's 5 years of discretionary review, that's 15, 20 public hearings to get a 12-unit building approved. And then you have The third bucket is construction costs. You know, in the Bay Area right now, it's $450 a foot to build an apartment. It's the most expensive building market in the world. More expensive than Hong Kong, Singapore, Zurich, 13% more expensive than the second most expensive market, New York City. So we have to fix all three of those buckets in order to make housing more prevalent and more affordable. And the easy one is zoning, and we can't even do that.
You said the easy one.
That's the easy bucket. You know, coloring in maps. That's essentially what we're doing. There are no mandates. We're coloring in maps, and we can't even do that. Just wait till we get to process, CEQA, and then wait till we get to start to addressing construction costs. You know, we are currently, we're moving deck chairs around in the Titanic and slapping ourselves on the back for doing so. And as the realtors representative said earlier, you know, permits are down double digits year on year. And at some point we're going to have to wake up and ask ourselves, what are we doing to solve this problem? Because I don't see any major progress being made on any of the major impediments to housing production. I'm seeing, you know, people, you know, making marginal plays, you know, get a few extra million, even a couple of extra billion here or there for affordable housing. 95% of California's housing stock was built by a market rate developer for a profit. And if your solution is more money for affordable housing, you're playing in the margins. Until we fix the broken market, we're not going to fix the problem. And I say we've had our shot at the easiest solution, and we couldn't do that. So I'm if you can't guess, I'm a little pessimistic about our future. I'm seeing the direction we're headed in. The only way we solve this housing crisis is a massive recession.
Let me ask you, oh, sorry, please.
And the housing crisis might cause a massive recession.
Let me ask you a follow-up, because your question, your answer sort of got at a larger dynamic that interests me, which is that I think you're sort of seeing a generational shift, whereas an earlier generation of Democrats was sort of solely focused on things like affordable housing and rent control. Not that those are not still in the conversation. We have a strong new rent caps law. But I think we're seeing a new generation of Democrats that are more aligned with development, real estate interests, who in the past maybe would be more vilified as sort of greedy developers, to oversimplify. And I'm curious to know if you think that's a sustainable shift, and if we're seeing sort of a new, more of an alliance of Democrats with developers and real estate interests, and if that potentially sort of augurs.
I mean, I think it's realism. People understand that you can't continue to create 8, 10, 15 new jobs for every housing unit that you permit and expect you'll maintain affordability levels. I think people are becoming pragmatic, Democrats as much as anyone else, to the fact that I'm speaking specifically for the Bay Area, but all of coastal California to a lesser degree, we're in a period of unprecedented economic expansion. And that should be seen as a good thing. Our problems are problems generated by growth. So, you know, before people say, oh, it's terrible, everything's awful, go visit Detroit and see what the problems generated by decline look like. So I think our objective should be to accommodate that growth in a sustainable and equitable way. And we have chosen not to do that. We've chosen to accommodate the growth, but not in a sustainable or equitable way. We've chosen to make housing more and more expensive, and we've chosen gentrification. We have chosen displacement. These are all policy decisions that we as a society have chosen. We are saying no more housing, but we keep sending the jobs. And there's a very predictable and natural and understandable outcome to that, is the people on the bottom rung of the ladder with the least resources get the boot. And we have chosen that. And you know, if we pretend otherwise, we're deluding ourselves.
Thanks. So my next question was for a member of the Newsom administration, who sadly is not here, so no feet to hold to the fire on that one. So I'll throw it open to all of you. Shortly after SB 50 died, the governor repeatedly vowed that we were going to get, quote, something big done on production this year. And so I'm curious to know if any of you have thoughts on what that might mean, and relatedly, tomorrow's the governor's State of the State speech. Is there one thing you'd like to hear him say as it relates to housing, a policy proposal, whatever it might be? So something big done on housing this year, what that might look like, and something you'd like to hear in State of the State. Anybody who wants to take that one, go for it.
I don't want to hog all the time, but I do have an idea. In his May revise a number of years ago, I think it was 2016, Governor Brown put a proposal out there and said, we're going to create essentially by-right housing in return for, I think he put $400 million into the budget, may have my zeros wrong, for affordable housing in return for a limited window of time for by-right housing that's minimum 10% affordable. I mean, that's an emergency response to a crisis. That's a big idea. And it would have essentially fast-tracked an awful lot of new housing, but not one single member of the legislature was prepared to vote for it because it had union opposition. And again, these are the nettles that need to be grasped in order to solve these problems, in order to make big systemic changes, in order to build the number of units of housing that we need. These are the sorts of things that we need to do. We need to break some eggs and offend some people. But I hope Governor Newsom has some proposals on that kind of grand scale. And I hope that we're deep enough into this crisis, further along than 2016, for there to be a little more support than just the Bay Area Council. We were the only group that supported Governor Brown's proposal back in 2016. I hope we would see more support for something larger and that's necessary to solve this crisis at the scale that it's needed.
Yeah, I'd echo some of Matt's comments about how the crisis. It's important for policymakers to realize that the crisis now is getting worse, that housing production is decreasing, that homelessness in California is at a new historic high, up I think 16% from last year. Some counties like Alameda County saw more than a 40% increase in its homeless population. And there's a conception out there that we don't need to do anything for the production of housing because eventually we'll just catch up. Like eventually we'll build all the housing that we need, or eventually, like we're building lots of market rate housing, and so we don't necessarily need more market rate housing, but we need more affordable housing. I mean, our approach has been that you need both, but it's certainly clear that California needs more market rate housing when you compare us to our peers. Like the reason, for example, I say this all the time, and it's something that I'm definitely looking for the governor to say tomorrow. The governor knows that there's a housing crisis, of course. Voters have made that very clear. He's made it very clear that he understands the urgency of California's crisis. And so I would definitely anticipate that he leads his conversation tomorrow with some notion of it. I'm not privy to what he's going to say about it. But I think it's really important for policymakers to know that the reason, for example, that places like Texas have significantly less, about 5 times lower per person rates of homelessness than places like California does, is not because Texas does not have a booming economy like California's does. It's not because it's not a popular place to go. It's actually one of it's one of the top destinations for Californians who are leaving California due to the high cost of housing. It's also not because Texas subsidizes low-income housing more than we do or has more rent control. It's because Texas has more permissive rules about home construction and builds more housing than we do over the long term and has. All those other policy interventions are deeply important. We've supported them all. But the reason that California has such historic rates of homelessness relative to our peers, according to all the experts, is the underproduction of housing here, which, as Matt said, is largely market rate production.
I think I would love to hear more about accountability and enforcement. So over the last few years, we've actually passed a tremendous amount of bills related to helping our housing crisis. So whether it's affirmatively furthering fair housing, strengthening RENA requirements, looking at things like in LA where they have CEQA exemptions now for homeless and supportive housing. There's a ton of progress that we've actually made. Part of the problem is that this has been decades in the making, and so we're seeing the ripple effects, and it's going to actually be longer. Even if we got the best bundle of production bills passed this year, it will still take years for that production to hit the market. So therefore, what are we doing now in terms of the laws that are on the books to keep people in place, to prevent displacement, and to make sure that we're sharing that prosperity and growth equitably? so that we're not just building for kind of a community that doesn't necessarily, could not reap the benefits, I guess. And we strongly support kind of what we call the 3 Ps, which is preservation, protection, and production. So it's an all of the above approach. So we're very supportive of a production bill this slate, but I also think that we need to do the enforcement and hold cities accountable for actually, who are, especially in the Bay Area, where we've seen a tremendous amount of prosperity and growth, but exclusionary suburbs have not shouldered their fair share of that growth, but have definitely absorbed a lot of the prosperity. So I think I'd love for the governor to say something on that.
A follow-up for you on that, talking about accountability and enforcement. Last year's budget, we got some carrots and sticks attached to housing production. Cities and counties that plan enough will get some money. Those that don't could face fines and sort of escalating legal consequences a few years down the road. But do you hold out hope for that sort of, pushing and pulling cities and counties along more to make a dent?
Yeah, I'm sure Gabriel has some more to say on that too. But from my perspective, especially being in philanthropy, one of the major things we're doing is working with certain legislators like Assemblymember David Chu, Nancy Skinner, other folks that have put out these bills from SB 330 from last year, 1482, which is the rent cap and just cause eviction. How can we play our role in helping that enforcement, right? What is the infrastructure needed in terms of legal aid, in terms of advocacy groups that can help partner with our folks in the public sector to get the word out, to educate folks, to give them the support that they need to make it happen? So I think that's our role in this ecosystem, but different stakeholders kind of play different parts.
Yeah, so I will agree with a lot of what was just said here, and I'm very curious to see what the governor is going to say tomorrow. I'm very eager to hear what he has to say. A number of things that I think are really important that he has to talk about are accountability. A big believer in the carrots and sticks approach, that we have to be supporting local governments and jurisdictions that want to do the right thing and want to be part of the solution, and we also have to be doing more to urge good behavior from those who have been a little bit recalcitrant in holding up their end of the bargain and their obligations. So I think accountability is a really important piece of it. Also accountability for all the funding that we've pushed out. The legislature has earmarked a lot of funding, created a lot of new tools, and I think it's really important if we want to do data-driven policy making that we get a sense of what's working and what's not, who's spending money, who isn't. So I think that's a big thing that folks are going to be listening for. I'm curious to hear what, if anything, the governor has to say around impact fees, development fees. I would expect that there is going to be a number of bills coming out of the legislature around that issue. Certainly something that we're looking at, so I think that's an important piece of the puzzle for folks to look at. I do think that the 3 Ps approach is one that has a lot of credence inside of the legislature, certainly something we're focused on, and how do we marry production with preservation and protection. So I introduced a bill very recently that would create a new $500 million tax credit to help preserve affordable units. We have 35,000 subsidized affordable units in the state of California that are at risk of converting to market rate in the next 5 years. If we have tens of thousands of families that wake up one morning and find that their rent has doubled or tripled overnight, that will have catastrophic consequences for our homelessness crisis. So preservation is certainly something that we have to be looking at in conjunction with this. And I'm very eager to hear what the governor has to say about production. And I think that is the big issue right now. We sort of came to the conclusion very recently that SB 50 is not the bill, that it's not going to be the vehicle, but we do need something to help, because we have to build, and we have to build all levels, whether it's affordable, whether it's middle income, at all points of the economic spectrum. We need to be doing a lot more building of housing, and that's something that folks feel very, very deeply. But I do just want to respond to one point I think that Matt made about the politics. I don't see this as just wealthy suburbs versus urban areas. I don't believe that Holly Mitchell and Marielena Durazo voted against SB 50 because they're worried about wealthy suburbs. There is another dynamic here at play, and that is the play of people in low-income communities who are deeply concerned about gentrification, who are worried that some of this production from the private sector is going to displace them and cause them to become homeless. And so I think the key is we are shaping a big and hopefully aggressive production measures coming out of the legislature, as that we are aware of the underlying political dynamic, that we have resistance from folks in suburban areas, but we also have resistance from folks in low-income communities, in urban areas. And so we have to get the politics right on that if we're going to move something forward. A piece that I would direct all of you to that I thought was really fascinating was Loyola Marymount University last year did a big public opinion survey in Los Angeles, asking people about their views on housing. And they asked people, do you identify as a YIMBY or a NIMBY? And it was literally 50-50. 50% of the respondents said they identify as NIMBYs, and 50% of the respondents said they identified as YIMBYs. They asked them a number of other related questions. They said, do you think that the state should get involved in pushing measures around housing, or do you think we should leave it up to local control? 52% said local control, 48% said that they thought that the state should play a more active role. So this, in some ways, housing is the wedge issue in California politics in Los Angeles right now. There's a lot of consensus around some of the other, we would consider the wedge issues in national politics around social issues like marriage equality or reproductive choice or other things. But the big issue that we hear all the time about from constituents are these issues related to housing. So we need to do a lot. There's a lot of work to be done, but none of it is going to happen unless we can get the politics right. And I think we learned a lesson from SB 50 about opposition from multiple sources. And if we're going to go forward and going to craft something that's really going to address this on the scope and scale and magnitude that we need to do, it's going to require being sensitive to the political dynamic on both sides.
Would you say this is the issue you hear about most from constituents?
So that's difficult to say. The issue I hear most about from constituents, without a doubt, is homelessness. I mean, everywhere I go in my district, and I represent a district that doesn't have the same levels of homelessness that, say, Miguel Santiago's district had. We don't see it in the same way, and yet people are still seeing it in ways that are really very jarring to them. And I sort of was telling the story one day over the recess. I was at both a senior center and a middle school and a few other community events, and it literally didn't matter demographics, the age, the income level, where I was in the district. The top thing that people had questions about was homelessness and relatedly our housing crisis. So I think this is the issue for voters in Southern California, is the really gotten people's attention and something we have to do a better job of, both at the local government level, but also here in the legislature to continue to push on local governments to do the right thing.
Can I make?
Yeah, please.
I think we've actually done ourselves such a disservice by pulling apart homelessness and housing. And I've been, part of that too, right? Because I'm like, oh, homelessness, that's a different set of interventions, that's different. But the reality is there's chronic homelessness, which is a population, right? And homelessness, which is a condition that is getting worsened by the housing crisis, right? People who are getting pushed out for short periods of time, whether it's living in their car or overcrowding in people's homes. And so I think more and more, and I've seen the governor actually do this, is start to talk about them together. Like even in that PPIC poll where homelessness and housing were the number 1 and 2 issue, it's so interesting because if you combine them, it's off the charts in terms of the importance and the saliency of the issue for voters. And so I think we all need to do a better job too of connecting the dots for folks and saying, opening up a navigation center or permanent supportive housing in your community is not only reducing homelessness, but you're also impacting the housing crisis. And so I just think that it's really important that all the folks that are kind of working in this movement and in this community can play that role.
I just want to jump in. I agree with that very strongly, and I might say it a different way, which is that if we want to really address homelessness in the way that it deserves and the fact that this is a moral crisis that we're facing right now, we've also got to get our hands around the housing crisis. Mm-hmm. The data that really caught my attention from last year's homeless count in LA County officials in one form or another housed more than 21,000 people. Mm-hmm. And yet homelessness still went up in the county 12%. So the big issue for us to get our arms around homelessness is homelessness prevention. There are so many of our neighbors and friends and people that are one emergency, one flat tire, one medical bill away from being pushed into homelessness. And so until we do something about housing, we're not going to be able to house people fast enough as they continue to slide into homelessness. So I agree, these issues are absolutely related, and that's why we have to make progress on housing if we're serious about addressing our homelessness crisis.
Yep. I missed most of the first panel, but and I hope Mayor Steinberg didn't say this because it's my favorite line of his. The only thing people hate more than homelessness are the solutions to homelessness. And people hate the visuals, and they feel guilty, and they feel terrible when they see people sleeping in doorways, and then you propose a navigation center or supportive housing or, God forbid, affordable housing anywhere that they can see from their balcony, and they go ballistic. Mm-hmm. So, connecting those dots and squaring that circle, that's the challenge we face. Mm-hmm. It's people, again, it goes back to what I said earlier. We make these decisions as a society. We expect housing to be the slush fund to pay for all of society's ills. You know, we tax housing to pay for housing. We tax housing to pay for schools, for roads, for fire, for homelessness, for everything else. And then we ask ourselves, why do we get so little of it? You know, there's a basic tenet of economics: the more you tax something, the less of it you get. And we tax housing to pay for everything. And we scratch our heads and ask, why is it so hard to build and why do we get so little of it? Well, duh, these are very predictable outcomes. Markets respond in very predictable ways to certain stimuli. And we put blinkers on when it comes to housing and expect that housing will not respond in a way that every other market does. I mean, if you take the automobile market as an example, if you told Ford, you know, you have to, you know, build your cars in this way, and you have to pay impact fees, and you have to hire this many people from this many, Ford would build 1,000 cars a year, and they would all be $500,000 each. And that's what we expect. That's what housing developers do. They're told that they have to carry the burdens of all of these different societal ills, and they end up building $1 million condos. And we ask, why are greedy developers only building for millionaires? So we've got to have a paradigm shift in our thinking about housing, and stop making housing sort of the beast of burden to carry all of these societal ills. You know, we need to share the load across, you know, the general fund and everything else, and just stop taking it out of the HIDA housing.
Speaking of property taxes to pay for stuff, as I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, there's almost certainly going to be a proposed amendment to Proposition 13 on the ballot in 2020 called split roll that would allow commercial property to be taxed at a higher rate. Chan Zuckerberg has been one of the funders of that, and one of the things that you will hear if you talk to folks is that part of the reason people want to amend Prop 13 is they feel it's distorted the incentives, and so cities will zone for commercial because they can get more tax revenue from that rather than zoning for more housing. So to what extent do you think split roll, if it were to happen, could help to change those incentives and encourage local governments to zone for more housing?
Yeah, absolutely. So Prop 13, man, talk about the third rail of politics, right? Like, this was untouchable. And so this has been decades in the making, I would say, or at least, you know, almost a decade in the making in terms of advocacy groups thinking about what is the structural change needed to really rethink not just housing, but just how we fund, because, you know, the majority of funding is going to schools. And so how we are thinking about how we fund, you know, social goods, right? And so doing this split roll just became, to Matt's point, about how we put the onus so much on housing production. This, I think, is really about sharing that burden across sectors, especially in commercial industry, right, which can really shoulder more and should be paying their fair share. And so we are very excited about the idea of a more equitable tax structure system that not only will support housing development. I mean, the rise of impact fees is also correlated with Prop 13 in terms of cities had to make up the gap for all the money that they lost in revenue. And so impact fees, job linkage fees, all of these things started coming up as a way to help bridge that gap. So if we just keep on saying to cities, okay, well, by charging those impact fees, you're killing housing costs, right? You're making it so burdensome to build housing, but we're taking that ability of local jurisdictions to charge those fees without supplementing that income with something else. And so the passage of something like split roll then opens up the opportunity, I think, for us to also rethink housing delivery as well as kind of other social goods, or public goods, I should say, in terms of both this kind of local control and state question.
There are a couple threads on that I want to pull together. I totally agree with Ruby here that the split roll initiative is a good idea. California CAYIMBY is supporting it. I think one of the reasons that it's a great idea is, in addition to the funding question, it's going to incentivize a lot of underutilized parcels, especially in places like LA, where you have these downtown surface parking lots that are being charged their 1980 assessments, and those are going to flip to a higher and better use because it's not going to be feasible for them to maintain as a surface parking lot, and hopefully some of those higher and better uses are going to be housing. But I think actually Prop 13, thinking back to the original question of like what comes next, Prop 13 is a good warning about what could come next. It was a dramatic overreaction by the voters to a real problem that homeowners had, and that the voters perceived the legislature was unable to take on. we need to do something about the housing crisis now, do something legislatively that can be tweaked and amended in the future, because there are sort of two camps of people who talk about the housing crisis and homelessness in California. There are one, I think everyone up on this stage is in this camp, who look at the dramatic consequences on people's lives and are empathetic to those who are suffering because of it. There are a lot of Californians, though, who just don't want to see homeless people. And it's their personal experience with homelessness, having to see it, that disgusts them and motivates their behavior. I mean, I see these people at city council all the time where they're proposing they're actually up there at the mic saying, we need to ship these people to Nevada in the desert and put them in a camp. And I'm terrified of what those people could do if they band together and put something on the ballot. And they're a lot more common than you might think, and they're politically very engaged. So going forward, I think what we really need to do is make sure that, A, we're responding to the challenges of the day, for sure, but B, that we're growing the housing justice movement in a really big tent way. I think one of the things that SB 50 one of the things that we've seen with SB 50 and with successful pieces of legislation and propositions is that really large coalitions of business, labor, environment, equity have come together and supported these types of initiatives. Growing the housing justice movement is imperative now because we need to convince legislators that doing significant things about the housing crisis is more important than preserving local control, which is something that we heard all the time in the legislature when we were advocating for SB 50. So we have to adjust the priorities there such that legislators feel like doing something significant on the housing crisis is a part, or they're feeling more pressure from a broader movement to do that than they are to preserve local control, such that places like Beverly Hills and those places can continue to do what they have always done, which is not approve housing. I think going forward, things like Prop 13 actually provide us a really, I think important warning about what could happen if nothing is done here today.
And now for the case against split roll, we go to the business community. Matt, why would it make things worse? Which I presume you believe, but...
Yeah, the Bay Area Council was opposed to Prop 13 back in 1978, and I think all of the predictions we made back then about unintended consequences have actually come to pass. We have created a society where we have those who are on the benefit side of the Prop 13 teeter-totter, homeowners who've owned their homes for generations, are accruing huge benefits and paying very little, whereas others, newcomers into the housing market, are being gouged. And then, there are always loopholes, and I think some of the arguments used on the pro side about buildings changing hands and not being reassessed are valid. But I think on a macro public policy level, doing complicated tax policy at the ballot is a bad idea. The ballot is a bludgeon, and this requires a scalpel. It requires thoughtful people negotiating around a table. It's a legislative process, in other words, that you get the best outcomes for things like this, not at the ballot where it's just who's got the biggest megaphone and can yell the loudest. I do agree that the fiscalization of land use is a real problem. I see it all the time. I spend way too many hours and late nights at planning commission meetings around the Bay Area and talking to city planners and council members who do bank land for commercial use that would otherwise be much better used for housing. In my own suburban community of Pleasant Hill, there's a housing crisis because we have a junior college where students can't afford to live anywhere near at DVC. And all around it, they have land banked for, there's a Kmart that closed 10 years ago, and they're hoping upon hope that Costco will one day parachute in and take over that site, and it's not going to happen. That site should have been developed for student housing decades ago, but they're banking it for commercial use and for hopefully. So I think split roll will further exacerbate that problem. I think the biggest problem with split roll is it takes the possibility of macro Prop 13 reform off the table for a generation. I think we need to revisit Prop 13 on the residential side as well as on the commercial side. And if this measure moves forward and you further cement What I believe as a homeowner myself, some of the unfair benefits that accrue to homeowners under Prop 13 on the residential side, I think you get rid of that possibility happening for a whole generation, and I think that's probably counterproductive.
Assemblyman, do you see any path to 54 votes in the Assembly to do something about split roll in Prop 13?
I just wanted to clarify for folks who don't know, split roll it is not touching homeowners. So it is just for commercial properties, because I know we've been kind of talking about it interchangeably.
Right,
But
yes,
just
thanks for that clarification, very important, yeah.
You know, I'm not sure what to say about that. I will say I've had fewer conversations with my colleagues about this than I anticipated I would. I think there's been a lot of more conversation about some of the other issues that we want to take on. Just a couple of thoughts to add to this. You know, I do think that one of the reasons I'm really big on the legislature doing something about accountability right now is, you know, we're hearing so much energy from our constituents, from the people we represent, and a lot of them want to take a compassionate approach towards this, right? One of the things that I sort of sense from folks I talk to in the West San Fernando Valley is they'll say, look, we voted twice to address the homelessness issue, twice to tax ourselves, right? We voted once with Measure H in LA County and once with Proposition HHH in the city of Los Angeles. We're literally saying to government, take more of our money and go fix this problem. And yet we're seeing so little results in terms of the actual solution of the problem. So I think there's a lot of frustration among people right now in government's fundamental ability to just take the issue squarely on, address it, and make some of the tough choices that need to be made. So that is something that has really caught my attention. I also worry a lot about, with some of the things that we're doing, what signals do we send to the market? The private sector is going to have to be a huge player in all of this, as was mentioned. You know, there is going to be a role for nonprofit developers and for private philanthropy, a very, very important role. But we need the private sector, and we need them to be building a lot more. And I worry that some of the conversations in here in Sacramento are sending exactly the wrong signals to market actors. And if you think about, if you're someone who's thinking about deploying capital, you know, into home building, are you going to build in Texas or California? You're probably going to take your capital elsewhere. And so part of that is we need to have responsible conversations here in the legislature about the things that we're doing to incent folks to come here and do the work that they need to do. But again, that needs to be balanced with the other piece, with the protection and the preservation, to give folks a sense that this isn't just going to be a giveaway to corporate developers. This isn't going to make some, you know, hedge fund titan in New York wealthy at the expense of California voters. So to me, it's a question of balance. It's a question of getting the politics right. But I do agree very much there is this sense of energy coming up from the electorate, and if we don't do something about it, we're going to be in big trouble.
So I think we want to go to audience questions, but I want to do one quick follow-up on that in terms of market signals. Briefly, rent control is going to be on the ballot again. It was on there in 2018. It lost overwhelmingly. We got a rent cap deal. The AIDS Healthcare Foundation, led by Michael Weinstein, is still trying to go to the ballot again, something a lot of folks fear will stymie construction. Do you think rent control, again, going to the ballot sends a bad signal?
Well, I think all the uncertainty sends a bad signal, right? We just did something really, really big. We passed, and I voted for it, a pretty dramatic, you know, statewide anti-rent gouging measure with just cause protections. It was, I think, a lot stronger than most people predicted would get out of the legislature. The governor gets a lot of credit for that. His personal involvement is really the reason that bill was signed into law. And it would be nice if folks gave that a minute or two to see how that was working, right, before going back. And I think this constant uncertainty, and I don't think that's sending a positive signal. So we absolutely have to do things to protect tenants. I've got some legislation I'm going to be introducing pretty soon around rental assistance, around eviction defense. These are critical issues that we have to take on if we want to protect people from sliding into homelessness, which I just talked about. But I do think that just a nonstop conversation about rent control where nobody knows where we're going to land is not productive and not conducive. And so I would be in favor of giving 1482 and the protections we just passed, you know, we're 5 or 6 weeks into the new year, give it a chance to see how it works before we go back to the drawing board.
Okay, who has some questions for our panelists?
My question is for either Matt or Ruby or whoever else, but given that the tech companies, especially in the Bay Area, seem to be driving so much of the housing inequality, the gentrification, that sort of thing, how much responsibility do they have? And also, with the talk of bringing housing to jobs, it seems like with the remote workforce, why is there not a movement to put jobs near the housing? Why is not Facebook, Google opening up a campus in Turlock or Lancaster, where there's lots of affordable housing, but there's no jobs there? Why are they opening and bringing more people to the Bay Area where it's already incredibly impacted?
Yeah, great question. So tech didn't create this problem, right? Our housing system is broken, and tech definitely has played a role in exacerbating those issues. So we cannot deny that. I think, though, that we're seeing a lot more traction from them to come to the table and be a part of the solution, which I actually think is more driven by the employees demanding that from their employer. So I'm very supportive of more organizing within tech companies to put pressure, because that actually works. And we support groups like Tech Equity that's working with kind of the rank and file tech employees to put pressure. But you've now seen Facebook, Apple, Google, Microsoft, which I know is not based in the Bay, but these companies step up in pretty big ways. We also launched the Partnership for the Bay's, or we were one of the founding members of the Partnership for the Bay's Future, which is a cross-sector collaboration between tech, philanthropy, banks, business, healthcare. And that's been also another kind of call to action and rallying cry for those in tech, among other sectors, to be a part of the solution, because it's hitting their bottom line too, right? They're not able to attract talent. When tech workers can barely afford to live in the Bay, like, what the heck are the rest of us gonna do? So it's not a good signal. And to your question about locating in other spots, I mean, it's actually a really fundamental question around, and that a lot of urban economists too talk about, right, around sectors clustering and the value of that kind of innovation economy, and otherwise why aren't they also in like Kansas or other places, right? So there is something there about being in proximity to each other that I think matters. And again, to what Matt was saying before, we've allowed all of those jobs to come, and that growth and that prosperity, but we have not matched that with our housing, right? We're at a ratio of about 4 to 1 in the Bay Area. So for every four jobs, we have 1 unit of housing. So we need to think more about restoring that balance. I think also transportation is another main issue. So people would be much more willing to live further out, or jobs would be much more willing to kind of think about the greater Bay Area as a place to locate if we had better transportation infrastructure, which I know that there's a lot of efforts underway on that too. But yeah, I'll stop there.
I do a quick addition. I hear that rhetoric a lot. Why don't tech companies build homes for their employees? And the short answer is, if people who build housing for a living can't build it, why do people expect people who design algorithms and social media platforms should be able to do it any easier? It's not a product of, you know, what you do for a living and who you employ and how many people you employ. I mean, that's never been part of our social compact, where, you know, employers are responsible for providing housing for their employees, unless you go back to the company towns in Pennsylvania and you get paid in scrip. Who wants to go back to that? You know, employers provide jobs and economic opportunity. That's always been their role in the social compact. And jurisdictions, cities zone land to accommodate that growth, and builders build it. That compact is broken now. And I don't think the solution should be to suddenly reinvent that compact and have employers build housing for their employees. And then as to you know, where should tech companies locate their expansions? Should it be Turlock and Modesto? We're working with a lot of Central Valley jurisdictions, actually here in Sacramento with Mayor Steinberg and Barry Broom at the Sacramento Partnership, to try and locate some of that Bay Area overflow, those spillover jobs to the northern San Joaquin Valley. But the basic problem is when companies look to expand outside the very congested, very expensive Bay Area, they're going, you know, and you lose that sort of that cluster effect that they're willing to pay the premium for. They're going to Tennessee, they're going to Texas, they're going to take the big savings. You know, moving to Modesto you're still suffering with California taxes and regulations, so they're just going to bypass the Central Valley altogether. And then, you know, if you have split roll, you know, not going to jump on this, but you're essentially, what you're saying is that the companies with the really high margins can afford to pay to take that additional hit. It'll be the companies with the smaller margins, you know, manufacturing, the blue collar jobs, logistics jobs, that you're probably going to see a greater erosion of those. So again, all of the societal ills that we're suffering in terms of disparity of income and other things, driven in large part by decisions made in that building across the street and by voters.
Louis, a follow for you to that question.
Sure.
Some tech companies have become big YIMBY supporters. Stripe has poured a lot of money in it. Facebook lobbied for SB 50. How important is, you know, tech companies not just pledging $1 billion for housing, but getting involved in policy advocacy for YIMBY? How important is that?
Yeah, I think it's been really helpful and very appreciated, but I don't think it comes. There's sort of a I don't know. Well, some folks out there have said, well, tech is taking responsibility for the crisis. I think they are definitely stepping up. The whole economic region in the Bay Area, in particular, is really stepping up to the challenge of the housing crisis. Facebook, Google, and Apple have all put in billions of dollars for affordable housing production, and all of that has been really helpful. They've been raising the profile of the housing crisis to the spot where you're really seeing Bay Area legislators and leaders agree that something needs to be done in a big way. But I think one of the things that gets lost in this conversation, and it's especially important as it relates to crafting good policy, is that California had artificially high housing prices as a function of public policy for 20 years before the internet was widely adopted by Americans. And it's also not true that California's housing crisis and the Bay Area specific housing crisis is being driven specifically by tech. Job production generally in the Bay Area is dramatically outpacing the production of new housing. In San Francisco, it's 8-to-1. Along the peninsula, in some jurisdictions, it's 20 jobs to 1 unit of housing. And those jobs are not all high wage. A lot of them are low wage and require more low-income deed-restricted housing as a part of that. But the central problem here is California's public policy about how we build housing and if we build housing, not necessarily the economic actors like tech in those areas.
One staggering, I forgot to mention this, one staggering data point that bears mentioning. I'm sit on ABAG's Regional Planning Committee. That's our Council of Governments in the Bay Area, Association of Bay Area Governments. And 200,000 people a day are driving from the Central Valley, where they live, to their jobs in the Bay Area. We have outsourced our affordable housing production to Sacramento, Modesto. So when people are complaining about housing prices and rents going up in Sacramento, you're welcome. It's us. We did that. So our spillover economic benefits are also our spillover problems that are coming to jurisdictions and communities around northern San Joaquin. We have essentially, and those people are not riding the train to work. They're driving single occupancy vehicles. Mm-hmm. So if I was to have one wish granted in this housing war that we're in right now, and one solution to solve it, it would be to get Mary Nichols and the environmental community into this fight. 41% of our greenhouse gases come from cars stuck in traffic, and we've done a great job at reducing our footprint from industry and from utilities and from everywhere else, but our GHGs from VMT, vehicle miles traveled, keep going up because we keep pushing housing. Development follows the path of least resistance, and apple orchards and cow pastures don't file CEQA lawsuits. That's where we keep pushing the housing to, and the results are very predictable.
Certainly an argument we heard for SB 50 that it was also an environmental law. So I am getting the signal that we are running out of time. Any final thoughts before I let you guys go? Anyone have a nice, concise, witty statement to close with?
Accessory dwelling units, build them. That's our last best hope.
Say yes in your backyard.
I think in general, we were kind of focusing a lot on this panel on all of these challenges, but I do want to say that this is the most attention and support around housing and homelessness solutions that we've seen in a long time. This issue has been going on for a long time, for decades, right? And a lot of folks have been signaling that there's a problem, but there hasn't been the public and political will that there is today. And so there's an opportunity to really accelerate change right now at the state level, as well as the local level, because people are listening and they want to move on this issue. So I think that there is some silver lining here in terms of it had to get this bad for us to think about big, bold solutions that will enable us for a more equitable, inclusive future.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of that. I wouldn't doubt at all that there is huge amounts of attention being paid to this in the legislature. It is on everybody's radar screen. I mean, I've only been here for a year and a half, but I can tell you that it is something that is part of all of our conversations. It touches so much of the other work we do. I think there's 100% a connection with our environmental work and the goals that we set that we need to have conversations with our friends in the environmental community about. So this is the issue that a lot of us are feeling, and we feel it not just because it's the main issue that we feel when we walk around and talk to voters in our district and get a real sense of energy around it, but because it's a real moral crisis. When we see people sleeping on our streets, when we see families being pushed out of the buildings that they've lived in and ending up sleeping in their cars. So there's a real sense that we want to do something about this. There's complicated conversations here. It is a very difficult issue here because of the balance of power between the state and local government, because of different concerns on the politics on all sides, from low-income communities, from folks in suburban neighborhoods. And so if we are going to do something about this, which we absolutely have to, the trick is going to be pairing the politics and the policy. It's not just about coming up with the best policy solution, it's about coming up with really strong policy solutions that are going to have the support behind them to advance through the political process and change the law.
How about a round of applause for our panelists, everybody?